Hey guys, how's it going? Today I wanted to talk about the different switch types available because it seems like there is some confusion on what the different types of key switches are. And there are three major types of key switches in terms of the MX types of switches. I'm only going to be talking about MX and MX compatible switches rather than things like Alps and Topra and that kind of stuff, because I feel like that's kind of beyond the realm of this video and I wanted to keep things as simple as possible. So some of you may know that the major switch types are linear, tactile, and clicky, but is some variation within each category, which I can't cover in this video because I don't have every type of linear switch, every type of tactile switch. That's just not realistic, but hopefully this video will give you an idea of what each switch is like. So the first switch we're going to look at is the Gateron yellow, which is going to represent our linear switch. So I'll just pop that open. So for the most part, the bottom housing is going to stay relatively the same between switches other than things like material. Same goes for the top housing, and the spring is obviously going to vary from switch to switch. If I can get this back in. But where most of the difference happens is in the stem here. So if you look at the stem, these legs here are smooth and create a just normal slope downwards. It's a pretty regular slope, and that's what creates that linear feel. And this might not make really a whole lot of sense right now, but once you see the tactiles, you'll hopefully understand better. So for our tactile switch, we'll look at the Dirac Koala, which is similar to a Dirac T1 from what I understand. So we'll also pop this open. And this one is lubed and filmed, but the bottom housing and the top housing are going to be relatively the same. And the spring, obviously, again, is going to differ based on what switch. So if you look at this switch, the legs here have a bump. So that's how it differs from a linear switch, which you have the stem here. And the legs on the linear are smooth, whereas the legs on the tactile have a bump and an irregularity in the kind of shape of the leg. And that bump can vary in shape, size, and position on the stem. And it seems like most people are leaning more towards a bump towards the beginning of the key press. But of course, that can all change based on a manufacturer's decision or whatever. But yeah, that's where the tactile feeling comes from. And you definitely feel that throughout your key press. And that pressing up against the contacts is what creates that feeling. So finally, we have our clicky switch. And this is a Cherry MX Blue. It's a clicky switch that a lot of people are familiar with. And the way this switch works is quite unique. The bottom housing, top housing, again, going to be relatively the same, but the stem is quite different here. We have something called a click jacket, and this moves freely along the stem. There's nothing kind of holding it in place or anything. And what happens is during your key press, these are together. And then once you hit that actuation point, this jacket will flick down and then it'll create that click sound. So if I grab the bottom housing and plop the stem on there, just trying to do this while recording is kind of hard. But yeah, together, actuate, separated. And in this case, you hear the click both traveling down and up, but normally you would only hear it on the travel down when the switch is completely put together. So we have one more switch type. This is a variant on the clicky, I guess you would say. This is the Novelty Sherbet switch, which is made by Kailh, so the housing is a little bit different, but for all intents and purposes, it's essentially the same, where the switch will still fit into the same slot. So the bottom housing and top housing are slightly different, but let's ignore that for now and let's have a look at the stem. So the stem here looks like a linear stem, but you also have this little notch in the back. So what happens is in the bottom housing, you will have that kind of click bar, which is this type of clicky switch. So what happens is that little spring there, what happens is that little notch will push that down and it'll depress it, and then eventually it'll flick back up because of the key press and the shape of the notch, creating a click sound. And this type of clicky switch is worth mentioning because I think this type of clicky switch is more common now. But yeah, that's the click bar switch. A lot of people will use box jades and stuff, and that's still a click bar switch, but the housing is kind of covered up to make for that water and dust resistance, but it's still essentially the same mechanism. So for this next test, I'm going to use a Kailh box jade instead of the Novelty's Sherbet because these switches fit way too tight in all possible ways that make these switches honestly difficult to recommend or use. So yeah, this box jade is going to take the place of the click bar switch. The reason why I'm using a box jade here and didn't show it earlier is because the box jade mechanism is functionally the same, but it looks a lot different and might confuse some people. So what I'm going to do now is basically just describe how it feels, because I can't really show you guys how it feels, right? The best way to experience this is using a keyword with a type of switch yourself, but unfortunately that's not always going to be possible. So on the F key, I have the gather on yellow, and that's just a linear travel, just nothing weird happening. It's just a button essentially with no kind of forced movement or anything. Any kind of movement in the switch is just you pushing up or down, which sounds weird, but you'll see what I mean in the next switch. This is the Dirac Koala. It is a tactile switch, and even when I'm pressing very lightly, once I reach a certain force point, you'll just want to go a good chunk down, and that's where that tactile nature comes into place. This switch has a bump at the very beginning of the key press, and it's evident here because I'm trying to make it a smooth travel, but that first bit is very almost jarring. Whereas on this, it's just, I can move it anywhere within this range pretty easily. This is the Cherry MX Blue, so the click jacket switch. So I push down halfway, there's the kind of threshold point, and it kind of forces me to push past that. This is the click bar, and basically similar thing here, where you reach the click bar, you have to push past that. Now let's do a quick sound test of each type of switch. This won't be indicative of what type of switch you might be getting if it's anything other than these switches here in a different setup as well, but it'll hopefully give you a bit of an idea. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a rough idea on what each type of switch can sound like. For me personally, I prefer linear switches. I did think I liked tactiles, but I also did just want to try a good tactile switch, and the Dirac Koalas fulfilled that need. I used to be a clicky person, but over time that does get a little fatiguing to listen to. And before, I did prefer Cherry MX Blues because the click was kind of nice, and the actuation happens right at the click, which I think is really nice to have that feedback. But on click bar switches, that's not really the case. At least with the ones that I've tried, a lot of the time you end up with the click happening either before or after actuation. So for instance, let's say I have the switch depressed most of the way, like halfway down, but the click hasn't happened. But on my computer, let's say that letter or key press is recognized, it actually happens. And then the click happens afterwards, which I personally don't like. It's something that I noticed after a while of typing on Sherbets, and I had already ordered box jades for another build. But yeah, that ended up being a big deal breaker for me with regards to click bar switches. Okay, to wrap this video up, some people might be saying, what kind of switch is best? Unfortunately, I can't really answer that question for anyone other than myself. For me, I know that I like linears, but that's after trying clickies, both click jacket and click bar, and then trying linears, which were these Gateron yellows, and then trying tactiles, a good tactile, not Cherry MX browns or brown clones, because I did try that Corsair switch tester that they have in stores, and honestly, I couldn't tell an MX Brown was tactile unless if I pressed super lightly, and I don't type like that. So yeah, I wanted to give an actual tactile a try, and after about 2 months of use, I'm finding that it's not really for me. I do like these switches, but in terms of daily use, it's not really what I want to use. So the best thing that I can recommend is that you find friends who also have keyboards. Find friends who have switches that you might want to try out, or switch types that you want to try out if you're still not familiar with them. I think that's the best way to figure out what you want. And so if you're trying to find out what switches are best for you, my recommendation would just be see if your friends have keyboards. See if your friends have keyboards with switches that you want to try or switch types that you want to try. Just be wary of, I guess, really the tactile area, because a lot of people get introduced to tactiles through Cherry MX Browns or those clones, and from my experience at least, those aren't very tactile. I was using one of those Corsair switch testers a few years back in a store, and I wouldn't know it was tactile unless if I pressed super lightly, and that's just not how I type. So yeah. So yeah, that's going to wrap up this video. Hopefully this was helpful, especially to newcomers to the scene, because I want people to get more involved in the scene and see what there's to be offered, because a lot of people don't really explain this kind of stuff, because the name does make it self-explanatory, but to me, tactile, I didn't know what they meant by tactile. I understood that you felt something, but like it's hard to really know exactly what you're feeling, because to me, clickies are still tactile. They still have a tactile feeling, right? So yeah, things like that aren't really explained by a lot of keyboard stores and whatnot. So yeah, hopefully this video was helpful with that. Anyways, if you have any questions about the switch types and whatnot, just leave a comment below. If you need any additional help, I'm sure there's gonna be tons of people in keyboard communities who can help you out as well. But yeah, anyways, that's going to wrap this video up. Thanks again for watching, guys, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.